It's 4 a.m. on a freezing winter morning in 1250 CE, and you're a 35-year-old merchant in Florence. You stumble out of your comfortable 3-story stone house, checking the locked strongbox where you keep your account ledgers, your breath visible in the frigid air. You haven't slept well because tomorrow you depart on a 6-month journey to the Champagne fairs, risking everything: your merchandise, your profits, possibly your life, to bandits, pirates, corrupt officials, and the eternal damnation the church promises for your profession. Welcome to medieval merchant life. It's not quite what modern entrepreneurship looks like. Today we're diving into what daily existence was actually like for merchants at Europe's bustling trade centers. And I'm warning you right now, this is going to shatter any romantic notions you might have about commercial life in the Middle Ages. We're talking constant moral condemnation, life-threatening journeys, extortionate tolls and taxes, and a social status so ambiguous that you could be fantastically wealthy, yet still scorned as a parasite and sinner. Let's start with a day in the life, because if you think your morning commute is stressful, medieval merchants would like a word: your day. From dawn to deals. The successful merchant's day began before sunrise. You would attend Mass at your local church, not just from piety, but because displaying religious devotion was essential for a profession the clergy constantly denounced as sinful. After prayers, you returned home for a modest breakfast of bread, cheese, and perhaps some ale or watered wine. By the time the sun rose, you were already at work. If you were a sedentary merchant, one who had established yourself in a town, your day centered around your shop and counting house. Your shop occupied the ground floor of your dwelling, with large windows opening onto the street and a wooden stall projecting outward under a canopy. Here you displayed your wares: imported silks from the East, fine woolens from Flanders, exotic spices like pepper and cinnamon that cost more than a laborer's monthly wages, furs, glass, jewelry, and other luxury goods. But you weren't just standing behind a counter. You were negotiating with other merchants, examining goods for quality, checking weights and measures, keeping meticulous records in your ledgers, calculating exchange rates between different currencies, arranging credit with banking houses, and planning your next procurement journey. The merchant Francesco Dattini of Prato left behind over 150,000 letters and 500 account books, a glimpse into the staggering administrative burden of medieval commerce. What were you selling? Everything from basic necessities to extraordinary luxuries. Merchants traded in wool, cloth, salt, timber, wine, beer, spices, silk, furs, glass, precious metals, and even slaves in some regions. The most successful merchants specialized in luxury goods because only these were worth the immense costs and risks of long-distance transportation. Common low-value goods remained local affairs. The transportation costs and tolls made them unprofitable to move far. And here's where things get dangerous. Because when it was time to actually acquire your merchandise or attend the great international fairs, medieval trade routes became some of the most perilous places in Europe. When merchants hit the road, medieval travel was an invitation to disaster. Whether you traveled by land or sea, death, loss, and financial ruin stalked every journey. On land, bandits were everywhere. Highways and forest paths crawled with robbers who specifically targeted merchants carrying valuable goods and coin. In early 14th century France, Pope John XXII sent 60,000 florins from Avignon to Lombardy under the protection of 150 armed horsemen. Despite this formidable escort, half the cargo was stolen. If the Pope's money wasn't safe, what hope did an ordinary merchant have? These weren't just common criminals. Many bandits were actually impoverished knights. called robber barons or Raubritters, who had turned to highway robbery to maintain their income. After the Hussite Wars in 15th century Silesia, night bandits became particularly troublesome. One notorious bandit, Black Krzysztof, terrorized travelers from 1500 to 1512 with such cruelty that his name became legendary throughout the region. Merchants traveled in caravans for protection, giving them strength in numbers. But even groups weren't safe. You had to hire mercenary guards, purchase weapons, and travel constantly alert. Many merchants disguised their wealth, abandoning comfortable transportation for shabby wagons, dressing in plain clothing and hiding their most valuable goods. And then there were the tolls. At nearly every bridge, mountain pass, town gate, and river crossing, local lords demanded payment. These weren't standardized fees. They were arbitrary extractions that could bankrupt a merchant if a greedy nobleman decided to charge exorbitant rates. Some lords were little better than bandits themselves, seizing goods outright under the thinnest legal pretext. Travel by sea offered its own terrors. Pirates haunted coastal waters and major shipping lanes. Storms could sink your entire cargo, and you along with it, in minutes. Ships were vulnerable to weather, navigation errors, shipwrecks, and the constant threat of war between seafaring powers. Yet despite these dangers, sea travel was actually safer than land routes in many cases. Pirates, while dangerous, were less numerous than land-based bandits, and ships could carry far more cargo than wagon trains. If you survived the journey, you faced another challenge: actually selling your goods at a profit. The guild system, protection, and prison. By the 13th century, merchants in most towns had organized themselves into guilds, the merchant equivalent of modern trade unions and professional associations combined. Merchant guilds were among the wealthiest and most powerful organizations in medieval Europe, often controlling town governments entirely. Guild membership offered crucial advantages. Guilds provided mutual protection, shared intelligence about markets and routes, maintained quality standards, regulated competition, extended credit to members in need, provided legal representation, helped members' widows and orphans, and wielded political power to negotiate favorable terms with local authorities. But guilds also restricted opportunity. Entry fees became increasingly expensive as successful merchants sought to keep out newcomers and maintain their privileged positions. Apprenticeships typically lasted 5 to 9 years. After completing your apprenticeship, you became a journeyman, working for a master while earning wages. But to become a master merchant yourself, to open your own business and join the guild's inner circle, you needed approval from existing guild members, a proven track record, substantial capital, and often the right family connections. The most powerful merchant guilds controlled all economic activity in their towns. They set prices, regulated working hours, determined who could trade, forced foreign merchants to pay entrance fees or prohibited them entirely, and passed laws favoring their own interests. By the 14th century in cities like London, Paris, Florence, and the German Free Cities, merchant guilds had become part of a new, powerful middle class, the bourgeoisie. You would think this wealth and power translated into respect. You would be wrong. The merchant's impossible position. Medieval society was built on a three-part model ordained by God: those who fought, knights; those who prayed, clergy; and those who worked the land, peasants. Merchants fit nowhere in this divine hierarchy. They produced nothing with their own hands. They merely bought and sold, buying cheap and selling dear, which made them, in the eyes of many, parasites profiting from others' labor. The church's condemnation was particularly severe. Lending money at interest, called usury, was considered a mortal sin, explicitly condemned by both Old and New Testaments. The practice could earn you excommunication, denial of Christian burial, and eternal torment in hell. Dante placed usurers in the seventh circle of hell in his Divine Comedy, alongside murderers and blasphemers. Yet merchants needed credit. Medieval commerce required advance payments, waiting months for customers to settle accounts, fronting money for goods that wouldn't sell until the next trading season. Without the ability to lend and borrow money at interest, international trade would collapse. So merchants and bankers found loopholes. The most famous was the Bill of Exchange, developed in Italy. Instead of calling it a loan with interest, merchants reframed it as a currency exchange transaction. A merchant in Florence would give money to a banker who provided a document redeemable in another currency at a different location. The difference in exchange rates, carefully calculated to include profit, wasn't technically interest. It was simply the cost of currency conversion. The Church, after much theological debate, accepted this fiction. The Medici family became spectacularly wealthy using bills of exchange, even managing the papal treasury itself using these techniques. The irony was thick. The very institution condemning usury enriched itself through merchants' creative financial engineering. Despite their wealth, merchants lived with constant moral anxiety. Many left instructions in their wills to repay money earned through interest or to donate extensively to the poor, hoping to purchase salvation after profiting from commerce. They dressed elaborately, lived in elegant houses with expensive furnishings, and threw lavish entertainments, partly from genuine wealth, partly to prove their worth to a society that despised how they made their money. The nobility cultivated contempt for merchants. Knights and nobles prided themselves on spending lavishly, on being generous and magnificent. Careful attention to profit and loss, the merchant's defining characteristic, was seen as petty, grasping, and beneath a gentleman's dignity. Yet by the 14th century, merchants were often far wealthier than impoverished nobility. Intermarriages became common, with cash-poor nobles marrying into merchant families for money, while merchants gained the social prestige of noble connections. Living in luxury, dying in debt. Successful merchants lived well, very well. By the late 14th century, major merchants' houses rivaled noble residences. In London, merchant John Pulteney's mansion Cold Harbour was so impressive it eventually passed into noble hands. These houses featured multiple stories, expensive furnishings, imported carpets and tapestries, decorated furniture, fine clothing, and private chapels. Merchants wore clothing that announced their wealth: long tunics of imported fabric, fur-lined cloaks, leather belts with pouches for money and knives for protection, expensive hats, and jewelry. The quality of your clothing directly correlated with your commercial success and social standing. Your table reflected your prosperity. While peasants ate pottage and coarse bread, wealthy merchants enjoyed imported spices, exotic preserved fish, fine wines, multiple courses of meat, including boar, venison, swan, and elaborate pastries. Spices especially marked you as wealthy. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and other Eastern imports cost astronomical sums. But this lifestyle came at tremendous cost. The expenses of maintaining your position, guild fees, entertainment of business partners, bribes to officials, security for your goods, losses to theft and piracy, bad debts from customers who couldn't pay, constantly threatened to overwhelm even successful merchants. Many merchants operated on extended credit, owing large sums to bankers while waiting for their own debtors to pay. A single shipwreck, a war closing trade routes, a customer's bankruptcy, or a bad harvest could cascade into financial disaster. Kings and nobles were particularly dangerous customers. They borrowed huge sums and often simply refused to pay, dissolving entire banking families with royal defaults. Why any of this matters, despite the poverty, violence, moral condemnation, and chaos, medieval merchants were genuinely revolutionary. They created the first international commercial networks spanning Europe, North Africa, and Asia. They developed sophisticated financial instruments, bills of exchange, letters of credit, deposit banking, double-entry bookkeeping that laid the foundation for modern capitalism. They challenged the feudal system, creating free towns with charters that guaranteed property rights, local courts, and limited self-governance. Though far from democratic, these merchant-controlled towns represented a radical departure from feudal lordship and helped create the conditions for later political freedoms. They transmitted not just goods, but ideas, technologies, and cultural practices across vast distances. A merchant traveling from England to Constantinople brought back not only silk and spices, but also knowledge of different languages, artistic techniques, architectural styles, and scientific innovations. The merchant class, the bourgeoisie, gradually transformed European society. As their wealth and power grew, they demanded political representation, forced legal reforms, built schools and hospitals, funded art and architecture, and created an economic system that valued innovation, efficiency, and profit over birth and tradition. Life was harsh, dangerous, and morally complicated. Merchants risked everything on journeys through bandit-infested forests and pirate-haunted seas. They faced extortionate tolls, corrupt officials, and arbitrary violence. They lived under constant religious condemnation, told their very profession endangered their immortal souls. They accumulated spectacular wealth, yet remained social outsiders, despised by nobles and clergy alike. But these merchants offered something unprecedented: the possibility of rising through commercial skill rather than noble birth, of building wealth through intelligence and daring, of connecting distant corners of the world through trade. They laid the foundation for the commercial revolution that would transform medieval Europe into the modern world. If you enjoyed this deep dive into medieval merchant life, smash that like button and subscribe for more analytical approaches to history. What other aspects of medieval daily life would you like to see covered? Let me know in the comments below. As always, thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.